Thank you very much indeed.
So the autumn statement. Did George Osborne pull it off? Did he? Was it successful? Was it just too gloomy for words? What should we make of the statement that we had yesterday? The first general point I would make, and it's one that you will see a bit of a debate about in the papers today, but is there any alternative to getting the deficit down? Is all this fiscal austerity necessary, or is it just a hair shirt that's being applied or being worn without purpose? Well, I think this tells the story of why it is necessary. We had a budget deficit of 11% of GDP as a result of a number of factors, but of course mainly the global financial crisis, but also going into the crisis with a budget deficit when perhaps after all those years of growth we should have at least had a balanced budget and maybe a surplus. So you have to get it down. You can't live with a peacetime budget deficit of 11% of GDP. Some of it will go down and does go down as the economy recovers, but I think the important point that was being made yesterday, the important new point, was that a larger part of the deficit is what is known as structural, in the sense that it doesn't go away as the economy recovers. So that's the bit that has to be fixed. And the difficulty of doing that, and this again is the new point, and I think we can debate these numbers, and people will debate these numbers. But if you look at what the financial crisis, as you will recall, started in the summer of 2007, and in September 2007, Northern Rock, we had the run on Northern Rock. This here was a prediction made by the Treasury in the spring of 2008. So a few months after the financial crisis had started, and this is what they thought would happen to the economy in subsequent years. So it's there isn't really a recession, there isn't really a period of slower growth. We get through it, and the economy ends up here in 2016. By the time the coalition took office and the first budget comes through, obviously things had changed quite a bit, because we'd had the recession, GDP had fallen, and then this is what was expected in June last year. This here, the bottom line, is what is now expected. And the difference between what was expected for the economy, what was predicted for the economy 3 years ago, just over 3 years ago, and what is expected as of yesterday is 13%. So between a seventh and an eighth of our economy will not be there in 2016. It's the kind of permanent long-term loss, and that's that is a lot of tens of billions. If you think that the economy is roughly 1.5 trillion pounds GDP, and you think how much you've lost. And the difference between what was expected before, even after the crisis and when the coalition took office, and what is expected now is 3.5% of GDP. So that's 50 to 60 billion pounds of output that we might have expected to have in 2016, and we don't, according to the new projections, have now. So it gets tougher to correct a budget deficit when the economy's productive potential is thought to be less than was the case before. We don't on the OBR, the new forecast, get a double dip into a new recession, but we come very close to it. So in this quarter and next quarter and the one after that, there is virtually no growth in the economy. This quarter, a small decline, followed by a couple of 0.1%, and that's within the area of where a technical double dip becomes very close. And the Bank of England has the same sort of view. The OECD, which came out on Monday, has the same sort of view of flat at best until the middle of the year. Now, it may be that this is too pessimistic. It may be that it is too optimistic, and I'll come on in a minute to the, to the great sort of euro elephant in the room, which everybody knows about, but nobody can begin to assess because it's too difficult and too horrible to think about what might happen if the euro truly does implode. Sorry, can you see there, or if I move over, I'll probably block these people here, so I'll move around anyway. So I'll block everybody for one moment or the other. But so we don't get a double dip, but we do get having expected much stronger growth than this, and the expectation back in March from the independent OBR was that we'd have 2.5% growth in 2012. Now they expect just 0.7% growth. So it's a big downward revision. You may ask how that reflects upon them as forecasters, but I'm sure they will say that there are plenty of reasons for that. But we don't get a double dip, but the period of slow growth is quite a prolonged one here. That 2012, 2011 was expected to be a pretty good year and hasn't been. 2012 will be, on their projections, even slightly worse, but growing very, very slowly. So despite that, and as a result of the announcements the government has made before, and the announcements it made yesterday, the additional announcements it made yesterday, which include extending the squeeze on the public finances into the next Parliament, and I think politically that is very important because the original aim, as you all know, was to be able to say to the electorate in May 2015, we inherited this terrible problem, we've sorted it out, and vote for who you like, but if you're natural Conservative supporters, you will think it's the Tories that really did this, so you'll vote in a Conservative government. If you're a natural Liberal Democrat, you'll say, well, if we hadn't been there, it wouldn't have happened. But so you may have ended up with another coalition, you may have ended up with a Conservative government, but there would have been, it was thought, a political prize for sorting out the inheritance. And now that becomes more difficult because the squeeze has to extend into the next Parliament, cuts in public spending for at least the first 2 years. The kind of, the diet that the government will have to present to the electorate is less appetising than it was before. But the deficit does come down. I mean, it's still coming down. However, it's not coming down as rapidly as was expected before. So this is the budget deficit in overall terms, public sector borrowing. This was what was predicted in March, in the March budget, only 8 months ago. And the reason this one is higher is because the data has come through a little bit better. But overall, the March numbers were all significantly lower than the ones we had yesterday, which are the orange numbers. So it's taking longer to sort out the budget deficit. It goes into the next Parliament. The fiscal rule of eliminating the structural bit of the budget deficit was expected to be achieved in 2014-15 in March, and now it's going to be 2016-17, and only with those additional 2 years of cuts in public spending. So the outlook for the public finances has certainly deteriorated, and I suppose that was the big message yesterday. And you can see it also in in what happens to debt. Here, this is public sector debt as a percentage of GDP. In March, it was expected to peak at just over 70% of GDP before coming down, and coming down, in plenty of time, so that the government could say it's falling at the time of the next election. Now it gets to a peak of closer to 80% of GDP because of the additional borrowing that the Debt Management Office will have the interesting task of funding, and it comes down, but it only slightly comes down, and not until 2015-16. I'm not sure that meets the fiscal rule, because the fiscal rule, there are two fiscal rules. One was eliminating the structural bit of the budget deficit. The other was to have debt falling as a percentage of GDP by the end of the Parliament. If you think that the 2015-16 fiscal year starts in April, The election's going to be in May. Can you say that you've met that rule when you've only had a month of that fiscal year? I think it's an interesting theological debate that will be had on that. But anyway, you know, it's taking longer and debt is higher. We will see again, if you believe the kind of forecast that we had yesterday. You know, the great prize is rebalancing the economy, so we're looking for, and we're still looking for this recovery that's led by investment, particularly business investment. Though, of course, as I'll mention in a moment, we had the infrastructure announcements yesterday. Trade, you know, as in the 1990s, an export-led recovery. Big fall in spending by government, government consumption is described here. Smaller fall in consumer spending by individuals. I would say that you know, at this stage of the cycle, we've never had consumer spending as depressed as it is now at this stage of a recovery. So you know, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second.